my channel. My name is Emma and it is time for the first reading wrap up of 2022. It is time for our 2022 bingo board to talk all the books that I read this month. I had a great reading month. I want to start by just reviewing the rules of Wrap Up Bingo as well as introducing the new bingo board. But Wrap Up Bingo is a game that I play on my channel. It is heavily inspired by the TBR games that are played by many people, but I just use it on the back end as a wrap up style thing. I came up with a bunch of like prompts, some of which could be like on like my wheel of TBR, and then some of them are things that like I wouldn't know until after reading the book, like its rating or maybe a trope that isn't in the summary, that kind of stuff. I don't know, I think it's just fun. Basically, I will show the bingo board in just a few minutes because we do have a new board. I will tell you about all the books that I read in the month at the end of each book talk section. I will bring the board back up and we'll talk about if I'm able to cover any of the squares with a marker for having read it. My rules when it comes to that is one book can only cover one square, so even if there are multiple things that it could cover, it can only cover one square. And my other rule is that I cannot bend it too far to make it fit. So if I read, let's say I had like a 5-star sci-fi as one of the squares on my bingo board, and I read a book that I rated, that was sci-fi, that I rated 4.5 stars, I couldn't bend it and be like, oh, I'm gonna round up it's a 5-star sci-fi. Like, it has to actually be a 5-star sci-fi. I did finish the year last year with this board. I was originally gonna do a December wrap up and feature this board and everything, but two of the books I read in December were rereads, so I didn't really want to re-talk about them. But also I looked and nothing I read in December would have covered the blank squares that are left, so I figured to just scrap that video in place of like everything else that I was focusing on with Bookmas. I'd always said that the first bingo board in January would be a new board if I didn't win during 2021, which I did never win in 2021. So we do have a brand new board, which I'm going to bring up in just a second. And we're going to play bingo again this year. Hopefully we win this year. I'm still not 100% sure what I would do if I actually won bingo. I was thinking about doing like a big book buying out haul or something like that. I'm just not 100% sure what I would want to do. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments down below. But without further ado, let's bring up the board. So you can see there's not a lot of changes. I use a website to make my board, so I just screenshotted the board and then cropped it to fit in the squares, so it's not, I feel like that part looks better, but I did keep my like hand-drawn little token things that I made just because, I don't know, I personally like them. But this year's a bingo board number 2, the boxes are a thriller, which can be literally any thriller that I read. Like, as soon as I read a thriller, I can knock it off. Like, it has no other qualifications. I also have a retelling on there. Again, any book that I read that's a retelling, that's an easy knockoff. Historical fiction, again, easy knockoff. Contemporary, easy knockoff. Romance, easy knockoff. Like, I think we could easily just win from that first row on its own. Moving on to the next row, we have fake dating, which is one of my favorite tropes. We have a book that does not match its summary. So basically, I read the summary, I went into it thinking one thing was going to happen, and it ended up being the complete opposite of the summary. A hate read, so this would be a book that I read and I just kept pushing forward even though I hated it. Probably rated like 1 or 2 stars. A memoir, pretty self-explanatory, any memoir could knock it off. A new one true pairing, any couple that I very much ship could knock that into place. A book that I read in 72 hours. A sequel that made me quit the rest of the series. A trope that I hate. A 5-star prediction. I do have a video full of 5-star predictions, so if any of those actually turn out to be 5 stars, we could cover that. Which, spoiler alert, from my 2 5-star predictions, what I read, I've completed the first list, and what I've read from the second list, I've only had one of those books actually turn out to be 5 stars. A book that is a surprising 5-star, a middle grade book, a book that had an adaptation, whether it's a movie or a TV show or something like that, that I watched in the same month. So if I read, like I recently found out that Hulu is making an adaptation for the book No Exit, which I do technically have on my TBR. So let's say I had read it, let's say I read it in March and I wait to watch No Exit until after I read it in March, then that could cover the square because I read the book and I watched the adaptation in the first or in the same month. A book that made me cry, pretty self-explanatory. A new favorite trope, so this would be something that like I've never considered a favorite trope, but the book I read made me be like, oh my god, I actually do love this trope. A character that I relate to, a book that I would love to see turned into a movie. I'm going to bend it a little bit and say and a TV show because adaptations are very much going both ways now. A couple that I do not ship. A sequel that's better than the first. So a book that I just really liked the sequel more than I liked the first. A book that has a shocking plot twist. And a book that I reread and I love more than the first time. That is the board. Anything that we cover this month, I will use the snowflake little sticker thing that I made to cover it. That way we can just kind of see what months bring high tokens, what months don't. But that is our catch up on the bingo board. Let's go over and talk some stats. In the month of January, I read 1,508 pages. Oh, I will also put graphs up that when applicable and when I can. You'll see some of them are like buildable, so like it will show what it was like compared to other months. Like the first one, like you'll be able to see all the months coming up too. So pages I read was 1,508. I listened to 31.68 hours of audio. I had an average rating of 4.16, and when it came to formats, I read 3 audiobooks and 4 physical books for a total of 7 books, which is pretty impressive. I'm not always the best when it comes to getting that many books. When it came to genres, I read 2 contemporaries, 2 historical fictions, 1 horror, and 2 romances. For audience, I read 5 books intended for adults and 2 books intended for YA, which those numbers are really surprising to me because I feel like normally they're a little more evened out. I read 6 books by authors who use she, her pronouns from what I can find online, and 1 author that uses she, they pronouns from what I could find online. Unfortunately, I did not do well with the race of my authors this month, and 7 books that all 7 books that I read were by white authors. I read 3 books by authors I'd read before, and 4 books by authors that were new to me. This month I gave 2 5 stars, which is so high for me and I'm so excited. 2 books at 4.5 stars, 1 book at 3.5 stars, 1 book at 2.5 stars, and 1 book I did choose not to rate. We'll talk a little bit more about that when the time comes. This year I also chose to track the queer representation in the books that I read. So 2 of the books that I read featured main characters or major characters within the book who were some form of queer representation. 3 of the books I read featured minor characters that were queer rep, and 2 of the books I read had no queer rep at all. And those are my stats for January, so let's get into the books that I read. So I kicked off the year by finishing This Time Next Year by Sophie Cousins. I did start it in December, but I finished it in January. This Time Next Year does feature content warnings for miscarriage, anxiety, and bullying. So This Time Next Year follows Minnie Cooper, who was born on January 1st, 1990. And has always had this one-sided rivalry with Quinn Hamilton, who was also born on January 1st, 1990, but he was born moments before her, so he won this huge cash prize, first baby born in London in the 90s. On top of that, Quinn's mom stole the name Quinn from Minnie's mom. Minnie was originally going to be named Quinn Cooper, but because the first baby born in the 90s was named Quinn and was a huge media thing, the parents decided to instead name her Minnie, so she became Minnie Cooper. And she believes that because Quinn Hamilton was born before her, that she has had this string of bad luck, and that he stole all the good luck that she would ever have. The pros of this time next year, one is that it featured many chuckle-worthy moments. I use purple tabs in my annotating for parts that make me laugh. I didn't annotate the beginning of it, and then I got a little distracted towards the end, but you can kind of tell there's a decent number of purple tabs for just like the more chuckle-worthy moment within this book. I mean, the main character's name is Minnie Cooper. Like, that in and of itself is pretty funny. Something looked weird on my candle. I just had to look back. But there were a lot of moments of these, I don't know you, but I'm going to make assumptions about you, but I'm going to be completely wrong with my assumptions about you. So basically, like, she'd be like, oh, you're so rich. And like, he'd be like she like had these complete meltdowns in front of him because she had assumed things about it. And I don't know. I don't really like those moments in anything. They're always very cringeworthy. And they work in enemies to lovers, but this I don't think was supposed to be an enemies to lovers book. So it just didn't work for me. Also, the main characters in this book were just extremely unpleasant. Both of them were annoying. Both of them I just didn't care for at all. I didn't want to read about them. They were just unpleasant characters, and they were kind of mean. Like, especially Minnie, she was mean. She was not like Minnie Mouse. She was mean. This book had so many tropes jammed into it. It's like it didn't know what it wanted to be. I did list some of them, so let me list some of the tropes that were featured in this book. Misconnections, enemies to lovers, a Romeo and Juliet like warring families kind of thing. One character judging the other without knowing. Like, those were all tropes that were featured in this book, and they just felt too jammed in. Like, most books you read are gonna have multiple tropes. I get that, that's fine. But there were just too many of them, and they played too heavily on too many of them, that I feel like if they had cut one or two of them, we could have focused more and explored them a little bit more. I don't know which one I would necessarily cut, but I think that there was just too many of them. The relationships in this book felt very forced, and then when the conflicts came to the relationships, those felt forced as well. Minnie's best friend, like, you could kind of see why they were best friends, but then they had to have a conflict because, you know, what would it be if they didn't? And that just felt so incredibly forced. And I was reading it and I was like, is this really what they're fighting about? Like, is this really the issue that they're having? Like, there is so many worse things that they could have been fighting about and having issues with, but that's what we chose to fight about. And it just all felt very forced, and I was not a fan of that. Overall, I ended up giving this book 2.5 stars out of 5. My final thoughts about this book, though, it wasn't something that I ever really considered DNFing, but it was also hard to find the motivation to read it. I think that towards the end of it, I was just kind of like, all right, I'm going to finish it. I'm just gonna finish it. And that was a day that I ended up like sitting in my room and I read for 2.5 minutes because I was like, I just need to finish this book. I also cannot think of a good specific recommendation for this. I've thought about it a lot since doing my notes on it and finishing it, but I just cannot think of a good specific recommendation. All right, so let's bring up the bingo board for this time next year and see if and what we could cover. So this book was not a thriller, it was not a retelling, it was not a historical fiction. It was a contemporary, it was a romance, it didn't feature fake dating, it pretty much matched the summary. I did kind of hate read it, like, it is a really low rating for me. It was not a memoir. Minnie and Quinn were not a one true pairing for me. It was not a book that I read in 72 hours. It was not a sequel. There were a lot of tropes, but none of them were tropes that I hated. It was not a 5-star prediction. It was not a 5-star. It was not a middle grade. It does not have an adaptation. It didn't make me cry. It doesn't have a new favorite trope. I don't really relate to any of the characters. I don't want a movie. I did not ship the couple. I did not ship Quinn and Minnie. I couldn't really figure out why people would want them together. It was not a sequel, it did not have a plot twist, and I did not reread it. I think for me the best square to cover is that it was a couple that I did not ship, because I did at the end of the day not ship Quinn, Minnie, even like their steamier moments or their more chemistry filled moments. I was like, I don't care, I don't feel it, I don't want it. So I'm gonna cover the square for having not shipped the couple. So the second book I finished this month was an audiobook, and it was Capturing the Devil, which is the fourth book and the final book in the Stalking the Jack the Ripper series by Craven Manor. This book does feature content warnings for gore, murder and death, and torture. So this book does follow Audrey Rose and Thomas Cresswell one more time as they set out to solve a mystery, and plays a lot back onto the original book. And that is all I can really say about it, because it is the fourth book in a series. That's like the best summary I think I can give it. So the pros, I once again loved the characters. Even characters that I didn't really like this in the third book, I fell back in love with in this second book, or this fourth book. I just really loved them, especially Audrey Rose's cousin is always one of my favorites. I just think she is really funny. I did a whole video which should hopefully be up after this one. I think it'll be the next one, or maybe the next one, I'm not really sure. But I basically did like a whole series talk about it. I just haven't started to edit it yet. But I kind of mentioned that if Craven Manor ever wrote like even a novella that followed Audrey's cousin and just took her day-to-day life, I think it would be really funny, because I just thought the cousin was hilarious and I loved getting to see her again. I loved getting to see the characters over and over again. Like, I love that in every book, like her father, her uncle, her cousin, they all make appearances throughout the book, because it really ties it together. I'm not a huge series reader, so I know that's probably normal in series, but there's just something about it, doing it in this, that I just really enjoyed. I love, without going too far into it, but I love that this also played on some Jack the Ripper theories. If you're into true crime and you know a lot about Jack the Ripper, which is like one of the few true crimes that I'm very invested in and very interested in, it does play on one of those theories, and I love that, to kind of start the book with a theory and then end the series with a theory. I just really loved, and I loved how much it played off the original book. So I love that it played on a lot on the original book, and it also played a little bit on the second book and the third book. There were returning characters from all three of the books before it, but there's a very important character in the fourth book, and I remember meeting the character in the first book, but I kind of wish that the character was actually like an even more important character, just to really bring home and punch in that they're really connected and how interconnected the books are. It was like the one and only con that I really had, and it wasn't a small con, but it wasn't a huge con. Like, I wanted to know more, but it didn't kill me that I didn't know more, but at the same time it bothers me that I don't know more. I have a lot of feelings about it that I don't really know how to describe without giving it a spoiler, but I wish the connection was just a little bit in your face, a little bit more clear. Overall, I did think that Capturing the Devil was a fantastic wrap-up of the series. There isn't really anything that I'm like, I want to know more of. Like I said, if there was ever a novella or a series about the cousin, I'd probably be on board and into it. But like when it came especially to Audrey Rose and Thomas Cresswell, I was like, all right, I feel like their stories are over. I feel like they are fully developed. Like, there's nothing left that I'm like longing to read about. Like, I think even if Craven Manor put out a fifth book, I don't think that I would be running to read it. Like, this felt like a fifth book within the series. I know she's published other books since this. I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything. To the point that like I don't even feel like I need to read the Becoming the Dark Prince novella. Like that, I don't even feel like I'm missing anything out by not having read that. It felt like a fantastic wrap up to the series. I did end up giving this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was well written and it was really good. For a specific recommendation, I haven't actually sat down and watched this. My mom was watching it while I was listening to Capturing the Devil, so I'd like walk through the living room and hear it and all of that. And it's this show, and it's called The Murdoch Mysteries, and it takes place in the same time period as these books do, and it follows the same thing. It's about murder and where like science was at that point when it came to like crime scene science, and I feel like they would feel very similar. Like I said, I haven't watched it, but there's just something about it that in my gut, like I feel like if you've liked that show, you'll be into it, and I think that if you like the books, you'll be into the show. I will probably eventually watch the show, I just haven't yet, but I really wanted to include it because it sounded so similar as I would walk through the living room. So let's bring up the bingo board for Capturing the Devil. It was not a thriller, it was not a retelling, it was a historical fiction. It was not a contemporary, it had romantic moments, but it wasn't a romance. They don't fake date. I don't even think I read the summary because I knew what the series was about. I definitely didn't hate read it. It was not a memoir. Audrey and Thomas are not new. I didn't read it in 72 hours. It didn't make me quit. It wasn't a trope that I hated. It was not a 5-star prediction. It wasn't 5 stars. It wasn't a middle grade. It doesn't have an adaptation. It didn't make me cry. It doesn't feature a new trope. I don't relate to any of the characters. I could see it being made into a movie, but it's not like I'm like, oh my god, I want someone to make it into a movie. I did enjoy it. I think I might have rated it higher than Stalking Jack the Ripper, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to look. It didn't have a shocking plot twist, and I never reread it. So I think the best one to cover is a historical fiction because it is a historical fiction, and historical fiction is not necessarily a genre that I gravitate towards. So we're gonna go with historical fiction. The third book that I finished in the month of January was The How and the Why by Cynthia Han. This also is the book that I used for my Buzzwordathon pick for Books and Lala's Buzzwordathon for 2022. So this book does feature content warnings for terminal illness, racism, domestic abuse to a side character, as well as it's very heavily focused on adoption, both from the birth mother's perspective as she's preparing to put her child into or put her child up for adoption, or as she prepares to have her child adopted, as well as the adoptee as she is trying to understand the world. So I know that that can be something that can be triggering for some, so I did want to put that out there. But this book follows Cass, who is 18, and she's never really wondered about her birth mom, but as she turns 18 and big parts of her world are changing and possibly changing for the worse, she starts to have more interest in her mother, so she sets out to find out who her birth mother is. All the while, we are reading letters that her birth mom wrote her when she is pregnant with her, so she's 16, writing to her baby, and we learn the story about how the birth mom became pregnant with Cass and how the birth mom has chosen to, or has gotten to the point where she's chosen adoption, and even like a little bit of Cass's birth story, which was awesome. And it was a very magical way. No, magical is not the right word. I really enjoyed that way of learning about the birth mom. Instead of having it told in like 2 perspectives, in 2 different timelines, like it's still 2 perspectives, but it's how the birth mom wanted her daughter to know how she got into that situation and how she made the choices that she made. The first thing that I loved about this book is that it was written by an author who was adopted in a very similar way. Obviously, it's not her true story, but it's still written by someone who's adopted, so it wasn't like they sat down and they just did a bunch of research and they decided to write about adoption. They wrote about it from their own perspective, as well as additional adoption or additional research on top of it. In the author's note, she talked about how she visited the school where in the book the birth mom was living and learned what it would have been like during that time for birth moms living there, and got like a lot of research. And what I also thought was very interesting through reading the author's note is that I believe she like honored the tour guide who gave her all this information. She ended up naming one of the side characters after her, which I also just thought was really cool. I love to see that kind of stuff in books and that behind the scenes factor. Like we even see it sometimes in TV, and I love that. I also thought something that was really interesting was that both Cass and her best friend were both adopted characters, but they were both adopted in different ways. Cass was adopted through domestic adoption, while her best friend Nyla was adopted through international adoption, with very different like birth mom stories. So they had very different experiences, which I just found super fascinating. I will say that I was obsessed with the birth mom. She was my favorite character in the whole book. She reminds me a lot of Lorelai Gilmore in like the flashback episodes in season 3, where she's just this like very cool girl and like you would want to be her friend, and just so young, but just, I don't know, the voice just felt like I could see that actress playing the birth mom, and I could see even like Lorelai Gilmore, if she had chosen to not have Rory, kind of having like the same style within the letters. As a former drama kid myself, there's a scene that I think Cynthia Hand did such an amazing job writing. Hold on, I want to pull it up. So this is like a quote from the book, and I absolutely love it as like a former drama kid, but it says, "We hear the rustling from the orchestra pit. The musicians are getting into their place. They start to tune their instruments and the house goes quiet. All of a sudden, there's a current of electricity in the air, running from actor to violinist, from violinist to stagehand, back to an actor, to me, to the conductor of the music, to Nyla, to my parents in the audience. It's like we're one single organism, breathing together, waiting for the lights." And like, as someone, I was the stage manager for my high school's drama department for a long time. And like, I remember that feeling. We used to have like, our pre-show ritual was we would walk around the music room to the song Get Together by the Beatles, or Come Together by the Beatles. And like, I hear that song and I still think about that moment, and the way that that moment is written in this book is just so accurate to what you feel and like the energy of it all, and I just loved it. It really drove home that for me, because I've read other books that take place in theater departments and you don't hear about it. One of the most uncomfortable things for me was there's a money subplot between Cassie and her friend Nyla that, although maybe realistic, just made me incredibly uncomfortable. It might also be that I was 27 and reading this book, and it was about 16 and 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds who maybe aren't thinking of it the way that I was thinking of it, but it made me uncomfortable, and it was something that was featured multiple times throughout the book. And it was just very odd, and I feel like it was something that maybe didn't need to be added into the book in the way it was. I think like the bigger subplot that it was being put into could have worked without this uncomfortable money storyline between 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds. Overall, I did end up giving this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Final thoughts. I am so glad that I liked it, because I had hyped it up so much in the past. I'd originally heard about it from Books and Lala, so I also love that I originally heard about this book from Books and Lala and now have gotten to use it as my Buzz Wordathon pick for 2022. Like, it just feels kind of like a full circle moment. But I was very worried that it would disappoint me because I had hyped it up so much in my head. When it comes to specific recommendations, there is a Lifetime movie. I think it's called Mom at 16. It features one of the Panabaker sisters. And I think that it's so similar. And I think that if you enjoyed that Lifetime movie, you will definitely enjoy this book. And if you enjoyed this book, you will enjoy that Lifetime movie. So this book was not a thriller. It was not a retelling. It was a contemporary. It was not a romance. It did not feature fake dating. It doesn't match the summary. I did not hate read it. It was not a memoir. It was not a new one true pairing. There was like no romance in this book. It wasn't a book that I read in 72 hours. It was not a sequel. I don't hate any tropes in it. I don't think it was a 5-star prediction. It was not a 5-star in general. It was not a middle grade. It has not been adapted. It's not a book that made me cry. It doesn't feature a new trope that I love. I did very much relate to Cass. I'm obviously not adopted. I'm not a birth mom or anything like that, but I've never read a book that wrote theater kids in a way that felt so realistic. And there's just something about it that I feel like if I had read this at like 16 or 17, I definitely would have seen myself in Cass. I don't necessarily care if there's a movie. I think it could be a movie, but I'm not like, oh my god, I hope it becomes a movie. It was not a sequel. It didn't have a shocking plot twist. and I haven't reread it as of yet. We're going to cover The Square, a character I relate to, because I don't think I will ever find a book that features drama kids and features them in a way that is as realistic as this book was for the drama kid and me, who played such a huge part of how I became who I am. And although I didn't read it at that time in my life, it is really cool to see that time in my life represented in the way that it was. The fourth book that I finished in January is Hang the Moon by Alexandria Bellafleur. This book is the companion sequel to Written in the Stars, which I did read last year. But this one follows Annie and Brendan. This one follows Annie and Brendan. Annie is the best friend of a character from Written in the Stars. Apparently I didn't leave myself a note for that. But Annie is the best friend of one of the main characters in Written in the Stars, and Brendan is her brother. Brendan had always had a crush on Annie, and when Annie comes to surprise her best friend, it turns out her best friend is not in the city. So Brendan takes it upon himself to hang out with her and finds out that she's given up on love, and he is determined to prove to her that she should not give up on love. So to begin, Brendan and Annie have amazing chemistry throughout the whole book. I loved them from like their very first interaction. And if you guys know, I did not really like Written in the Stars, and one of my biggest complaints was that I didn't feel the chemistry between Elle, is not the one whose sister it is, but Elle is one of the characters, Elle and her love interest. I didn't feel the chemistry between. So to read this book and be able to feel the chemistry, I was so excited, so grateful that I could feel it, because I just couldn't in the other ones. As someone who grew up on late 90s, early 2000 rom-coms, I loved all the references to them. It was really cute. There were ones that I was like, oh, I definitely know what this was, but then there's others that I'm like, this could be like a variety of different ones, and some that are just cute romantic moments that have been so romanticized by our society that any hopeless romantic like myself would want to experience one day. And I loved it to my core. As you guys know, I love to feature clips that overlay over here on my channel of movies that I reference or moments that I reference, because as much as I love to read, I love film and I love television so much too. And that just like played so much on me. I also have like recently been just like feeling a pull to want to visit Seattle, Washington. Not even just recently, forever. It's just always been somewhere that I want to visit. There's just something about Seattle that I've always wanted to visit. So it was kind of cool to read about those moments and like famous Seattle locations. Also, for me, a good romance is a romance where you can feel the butterflies in the moments when you know the characters will feel them. And this book had some really good romance and butterfly moments. Like, I wish I had been reading it physically so that I could annotate some of those moments. I listened to it on audio, so I cannot annotate it, but it was like, it had some really good romance and butterfly moments, and I loved that about this book. Overall, I gave this book 5 stars, which completely shocked me because I think I gave Written in the Stars like 3 stars, and it was a low 3 stars. For a book recommendation, I think that if you enjoyed the book Alex Approximately by Jen Bennett, I think you would enjoy this book. They had very similar like movie moments, which is where I kind of got the connection from. And if you're a fan of late 90s, early 2000 rom-coms and some of those amazing rom-com moments, I definitely think you will also enjoy this book, because it just plays so much and it's such an homage and such a love letter to that genre that I think that if you have watched it, you'll enjoy it. So this book is not a thriller, it is not a retelling, it is a contemporary, it is a romance, it doesn't feature fake dating. I don't know if I really read the summary because it was kind of a sequel. I did not hate it. It was not a memoir. I could see them being like my favorite pairing of the year. I did not read it in 72 hours. It did not make me quit. It actually made me want to read the next one. It did not feature I mean, it kind of features a trope that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not a huge fan of the dating the best friend's sibling trope. So it does kind of feature it, but not, it didn't ruin my reading experience at all. It was not a 5-star prediction. It was a surprising 5-star. It was not a middle grade. It has not been made into a movie. It did not make me cry. It didn't give me a new trope to love. I don't want it to be made into a movie. I don't think it needs to be made into a movie. It was a sequel that's better than the first. It didn't have a shocking plot twist, and I've never reread it. Ultimately, I think the best place to cover, though, is a surprising 5-star, because never in my wildest dreams, like when I was making my January TBR, did I think that I would add this one as a 5-star read for 2022. Next book that I finished in the month of January was Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly. This book does feature content warnings for transphobia, homophobia, and dysphoria. But this book, oh my god, I forgot to look it up. Okay, so I'm pretty sure this character's name is Dahlia. Her name is spelled D-A-H-L-I-A. The whole time I was reading it, I was pronouncing it in my head as Dahlia, but I guess it could be Delia as well. But I'm going to go with Dahlia. As I'm saying it, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. It's just honestly what I thought it was, and I forgot to look it up. But this book follows Dahlia and London, who are on a cooking show. Did I write what it's called? Because I don't remember what it's called. Did not write what it's called. It's very similar, though, to the Food Network show Chopped. And London is the first openly non-binary cast member on this show. So they use they, them pronouns. And that does play a part within the book. During their time on the show, they also fall in love because it's called Love and Other Disasters. This book was one of my most anticipated releases for 2022. As soon as I read the summary, I was here for it. This is the first book that I've read where a main character is non-binary. I can't even off the top of my head think of a book that I've read where there's just like a non-binary character in general. But something that I thought Anita Kelly did that was so cool, this is from the book, and it says, "And I just worry," Lizzie went on, "that they might have told you some inaccurate things about me." Except Lizzie didn't say they. So I liked that the author respected these characters' pronouns while also like showing that people like, oh my god, what's the word? Oh, misgender. That's the word I'm thinking of. People misgender people all the time. But the author still had like character integrity and character respect for these characters that she's written. And used the correct pronouns. And I really liked how they did that in the book. And it just, I don't know. It's not something that I'm super versed in yet. I am not someone who, I use she, her pronouns. I am cisgender, so I know that I don't have a lot to say about it. I am going to look for some own voices reviews of this book because I do think that that's more important than what I have to say, but that was just something that as someone who is cisgender, it stood out to me because I had never thought of, like, if I ever write a non-binary character, of doing something like that, but it also just feels so important and so respectful to do towards your character. Anita Kelly themselves is non-binary. She uses she, they pronouns. So obviously they do have some insight into what the character of London is feeling, but I am also going to look for some own voices reviews that I can link down below for you as well. One thing that I will say about this book is that the timeline was really, really confusing. I could never figure out how much time had lapsed since they were filming, since they saw each other, when the weekends fell. Like, it just, there was times where I was like, this needed better world building, which we don't always think about in contemporaries, but it just needed a better world building system, especially because although it very much seems to follow kind of like the structure of like what Chopped is, it is its own made-up show, so it needs a little bit of world building for that, for the fact that it's a show, and it's a show that I can't just hop on Hulu and look up this show and like be able to somewhat understand it. And even if I did, like, I don't know the filming schedule of Chopped. I don't know if they film an episode a day or if they film an episode over the course of 4 days or what it is. Like, I know I could go Google that, but I just, because it was a made-up show, I wanted more information on it. When it came to the romance itself, the chemistry was lacking in certain moments, and especially towards the end of the book, the attraction and the love through the majority of the book, but especially at the end, the attraction and the then found love between the two characters felt very one-sided to me. Like, if I had to guess, I don't think that Dahlia and London stay together forever after the epilogue. In fact, I feel like one of them is coming to terms with parts of themselves that would make it that they wouldn't want to stay with the other person. I don't think that they are a couple that lasts the test of time. And I think that the person who on my end, when I was reading it, the attraction felt very one-sided on, I think the person who was attracted is in for a world of hurt and a huge heartbreak from the other person. Like, I did not feel the chemistry, and I was so disappointed by that. I don't have any like other books or specific movie recommendations, but I think if you're fans of things like Chopped or Cake Wars, you'll be very interested in this book. For me, I'm not super into like the cooking versions, but I do love the show Ink Master. So like, I think that also drew me in. Like, it reminded me of like the food version of Ink Master. And I will be honest, the whole time that I was reading the book, even though I believe the judges were 2 males and a female, I was picturing the 3 judges from Ink Master the whole time. Every last moment of it. This book was not a thriller, it was not a retelling, it was a contemporary, it was a romance. It did not feature fake dating, it matched the summary pretty well. I didn't hate it. It wasn't a memoir. They are not a new OTP. They are not, I didn't read the book in 72 hours. It was not a sequel. I don't hate any of the tropes. It wasn't a 5-star prediction. It wasn't a middle grade. It doesn't have an adaptation. It didn't make me cry. It doesn't have a new favorite trope. I don't think it would be made into a movie. It wasn't a sequel. It didn't have a shocking plot twist, and I have not reread it. Overall, I am going to cover up the romance because out of all the boxes, it definitely is more of a romance than a contemporary. So the next book that I finished in the month of January was called Craven Manor by Darcy Coates. I started this book in October or November of 2021. I don't have a lot to say about it because I read it so sporadically and nothing really stuck with me. I actually ended up deciding not to rate it because how little I like comprehended of the book and how spacey I would get sometimes while I was listening to it. I didn't feel like I could properly rate it or properly review it, but I did finish it. So I am adding it to my finished list of books. I can't give a recommendation, obviously. I feel comfortable giving it a rating. There's not a lot I can say about it. I will say that I am planning to give Darcy Coates another chance. I would like to believe that my brain was not in the right mindset to read anything audio whenever I would listen to it, because when I was listening to like probably the last 10 to 15%, which was what I was listening to in January, I did comprehend a lot of it. I do understand the ending, which makes me believe that I just was not in the right headspace to listen to something at that time. So I am going to give Darcy Coates another chance. I don't think that this has anything to say with her writing. I just was not following it very well. So I did read it. I am not going to cover anything on my bingo board for it, even if it could cover a square, because I didn't rate it. I'm barely reviewing it, but I did read Craven Manor. So if my face looks really red or my eyes are watering, I just had this very intense coughing fit. It came out of nowhere, so I apologize for that. But the final book that I finished in the month of January was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So Malibu Rising does feature content warnings for alcoholism, death of a parent, abandonment, drug use, abuse, and sexual harassment. This book follows the children of the famous singer Mick Riva, who also happens to be one of the ex-husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but it follows the 4 children of Mick Riva, so Nina, Jay, Hud, and Kit. and it follows their life as they grow up, with Mick not being really part of their lives, but this huge name that everyone knows because he is a famous singer. I very much in my mind kind of equate him with like Elvis. I've seen, and I do plan to do a video on it, but it's like fan casting for Evelyn Hugo, and I want to like react to it, but I've seen people saying that like Mick Riva should be casted as Harry Styles. The one thing I will say, I'm about to go on a tangent and I'm sorry, but I've heard that the rights have been bought for Daisy Jones and the Six, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and Malibu Rising, and that Mick Riva makes appearances in all three. I do think that Mick Riva should be played by the same actor in all three, which makes me believe that like Harry Styles would be hard to cast, but that's neither here nor there. We got lost on a tangent. It follows their lives as they grow up. The first half of the book is the first 12 hours of like the main day that this book follows, and basically they are preparing for the Riva's annual end of summer party that Nina hosts at her house every year. And also during that first 12 hours we are getting flashbacks from when Mick met their mom, to like each of their births, to pretty much where we are in present day. And it's basically their family story. And then the second half of the book is the party itself. I liked that for this book, the characters that I loved. Like the characters who I loved in this book were some of my favorite characters that I've ever read. I loved them. I was rooting for them. But then the characters that I hated, they were characters that I hated. So I either very much loved them or I very much hated them. And I loved that. I thought that it was really well written writing. Like, I'm not condoning everything that the characters that I loved did, but like I was rooting for them to have a successful outcome. I really, really enjoyed the flashbacks. For the first part of the book, all I wanted to read were the flashbacks, and then the second part of the book I was invested in the current timeline and the party. But when it came to like the first part, I like was like, I just want to know about the flashbacks. The flashbacks were what were important to me. I think that when one day I do reread Malibu Rising, because I know at some point I will probably end up rereading it, that I probably will be able to better pay attention to the current storyline, like the present day in the book storyline, because I will have like the whole family story kind of in my mind. But I was so intrigued by how these characters got to where they are, even to like who the parents were at the beginning, like how their kids had the relationship that they had in the present day. So I was very invested in the flashbacks in this reading. I think when I reread it again, I will be maybe more invested in the current day. I've never once in my life surfed. I don't know if I ever will want to surf, but the way that Taylor Jenkins Reid writes the surfing scenes is beautiful. I love it. It's captured so well, and it's just something that I truly, truly enjoyed. At the end of the book, Nina, who is the oldest sister, has this beautiful speech that she gives pretty much her whole family, but to one member in particular of her family. And it's just so powerful, and I read it and I could resonate with it, and I just truly, truly just enjoyed it. It was not like a happy speech by any means, any stretch of the imagination, but it was relatable and it was real, and it just felt right for her character. And the whole time I was reading it, I was waiting for that speech. Like, that was the moment that I was waiting for through the whole reading of this book. And the ending of the book overall just left me very satisfied. I was very satisfied by the ending. Something I thought was gonna happen didn't happen, and the closer and closer I got to the end of it, the more I was like, thank God it didn't happen, because I don't think there's enough of the book to deal with like the aftermath of it. I think that it could have had like a mysterious ending if she wanted to take the route of the one thing I thought was gonna happen that didn't happen. But overall, I left satisfied. I closed the book and I had that moment of like, okay. Like, I don't know how to describe it other than I was satisfied with it. And I think that satisfaction also is what pushed it from one rating to another. Biggest thing that I did not like about this book, though, was that in the second part of the story, so the second 12 hours, we were getting these like moments of, there were like 4 or 5 page descriptions about what was happening with side characters, but you were also getting their history, and I was like, I don't care about any of these people. Like, I only want to read about the Rivas, to the point that, like, after I talked to a friend of mine who had read it, and she was like, yeah, no, that doesn't, like, you don't need to know about these characters. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna skip. Like, if a member of the Riva family is not in this scene, I'm gonna skip it. But when me and my friend were talking about it, we were wondering if, like, because the last 3 books that Taylor Jenkins Reid has published have all taken place in the same universe and have had characters featured from other books, we were wondering if maybe some of these side characters are almost like the book equivalent of like a backdoor pilot.
Hey, editing Emma here, and also sick Emma here, so if my voice sounds weird, that's why. But since filming this video, actually like literally days before I'm getting ready to upload this, it was announced that me and my friend were somewhat right, because Taylor Jenkins Reid did announce her 2020 release, which is Carrie Sudo is Back, which is a character from Malibu Rising, who did have a small feature in the second section of the book. So we were right, and that just makes me incredibly happy. But yes, she is coming out with another book, but I still don't like all the random side stories that I didn't care about.
Like, I don't know if maybe that's was the intention, or if this was just more of a literary fiction book, and that's just very common within the genre, but I did not really enjoy it. Overall, I gave it a 5-star. It's very hard for Taylor Jenkins Reid not to get 5 stars from me. I do really enjoy her writing. This book is not an all-time favorite, but it definitely is deserving of its 5-star ranking. And for a specific recommendation, I think that if you enjoy the show This Is Us, you will very much enjoy Malibu Rising, because of the way This Is Us is written, and the flashbacks and the present day and the way they weave together and the way that they connect to who the characters are. It's just, it's so similar to the way that Taylor Jenkins Reid did it in this book. So I think that if you enjoy the show, you'll enjoy this. Let's bring up the bingo board. So this book was not a thriller, it was not a retelling, it was not a contemporary, it doesn't feature fake dating. It matched the summary. I didn't hate it. It was not a memoir. There wasn't really a one true pairing in it. I didn't read it in 72 hours. It didn't make me quit a series. It doesn't have a trope that I hate. It was not a 5-star prediction. It was almost a 5-star prediction, but was not. It was not a middle grade. It doesn't have an adaptation yet. It didn't really make me cry. Like, there was more like the goosebump moment and like moments of like reflection, but I never like shedded a tear. It doesn't have a new trope that I love. It is being turned into like a movie or a TV show. I can't remember which. But like, I don't necessarily care that it's like, I'm gonna watch it. Don't get me wrong, I'm gonna watch it. But like, it's not like I'm like, oh my god, I'm so excited. It wasn't better. It wasn't a sequel that was better. It didn't have a shocking plot twist, and I haven't reread it yet. So I will not be adding any bingo for this one. Just really quickly, we'll keep the bingo board up while it's here. So I think we did fantastic for the first month of our bingo board for this year. Like, we're so close to bingo on the far right column, but overall it's looking pretty good. I really hope that we don't win in February, because I don't know, it just would feel so early, but I feel like I have a good feeling that we might win this year. And that's the bingo board. Final look of the January books. I love that they all like somewhat live in this like blue family, for at least the physical books that I own. I just think that's kind of cool. When it came from my least to my favorite to my least favorite this year though, Hang the Moon would definitely be my #1 book this month. I loved it. I had very little to nothing wrong with it. Second place would go to Malibu Rising. Third place would go to Capturing the Devil, which was one of the other audiobooks. Then The How and the Why. Then Love and Other Disasters. This time next year, and Craven Manor is not going to be part of the rankings, as we talked about before, because I don't really know. But yeah, this was January, and I am pretty darn impressed. If you've read any of these books, how did you feel about it? What was your favorite book that you read in January? And if you got all the way to the end of this book, or to the end of this video, I know it was a long one, leave a moon in your comments to represent my favorite book this month, Hang the Moon. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in another video. Bye, worlders. This is like bothering me. Okay. God, this is really bothering me. I'm sorry. Follows Minnie Cooper. Oh my God, I forgot to do the bingo board twice. All right, hold on. Hang the Room is like Eleanor. Who's Eleanor? Ah, no, don't. It fell.